Thank you for joining us today. Good morning and welcome to our monthly Mornings with O'Keeffe program. My name is Grace Almanza. I'm the School and Tour Programs Manager here at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. I would like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude and acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. Additionally, I would like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today. Your support makes this event possible every month. And if you're not yet a member and enjoy this program, please consider joining today. You can do that by visiting gokm.org/membership to learn more. Throughout this talk, we have disabled the chat box, I believe, so please feel free to place your questions in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. At the end of the lecture, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. And if you have any pressing questions, you can also always email learning@o'keeffemuseum.org. Please note that following today's talk, a recording will be made available on the O'Keeffe Museum's website in about a week's time. Captions in both English and Spanish are available. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Anne Daly. Spent her academic career as a professor at the University of Texas at Austin and is now working on a book about Georgia O'Keeffe's art and art making. She is the author of Done into Dance, Isadora Duncan in America, and a volume of collected works titled Critical Gestures. She has contributed to the New York Times, the Houston Chronicle, and Chronicle of Higher Education. You can access more of her O'Keeffe research online at annedaly.com. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to our guest speaker for today.
Thank you, Grace. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me and Grace and the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum so early after a long holiday weekend. Today, we turn back the clock 100 years, a full century, to one of O'Keeffe's earliest milestones as an artist. Today, we know Georgia O'Keeffe as a cultural icon. Her name and her image signal creativity, independence, feminist power. Each one of us can add something to that list. I've spent my career as an academic studying women artists like Isadora Duncan, who came of age during the first flush of American modernism. And I've always been most interested in their early years and how they invented themselves. So what I'd like to do this morning is to bring us all back to 2 weeks in early 1923, when Georgia O'Keeffe hit the big time. Last slide, please. So here's the front of the exhibition brochure. As you can see, nothing fancy. To our eyes, maybe a little bit sober, maybe to their eyes, a little elevated. No color reproductions or brand logos. Remember, this is 1923. There were barely decent black and white reproductions in the US, let alone color ones. But we get what we need: title, location, date, opening times, as well as the cast of characters. Now, that lengthy title interests me. It begins, Alfred Stieglitz Presents. It is immediately apparent to us who gets top billing, who is making claims for this exhibit, who is the literal frame for this event. And Stieglitz did think in terms of events. He described an art auction he held the previous year as the artist's derby. He did love the horse races. O'Keeffe comes a little further down the marquee, and she's labeled as an American. At this stage, Stieglitz was making the argument that homegrown modern artists were every bit as good as their more renowned French counterparts. And the number of, quote, oils, watercolors, pastels, and drawings are specified, and even 100. Now, actually, it seems to have turned out to be 101, and there is evidence, according to the exhibition price list, which suggests that the number grew to 137 5 days after the opening. Now, whether that was the number of works for sale or on the walls or both isn't quite clear, so I'll be keeping that research loop open. So whether 100 or 101 or 137, that's a lot of artworks for an art exhibit. Actually, it's over the top for an artist's exhibit, what today we might call a blockbuster. At the bottom of the page, we can see the Anderson Galleries as the venue. It gets equal billing in the same large typeface and all caps, and its president, Mitchell Kennerly, gets his credit as well, and we'll hear more about him later. So why was this exhibit such an over-the-top event? Because this exhibit had a point to make. It had been nearly 6 years since O'Keeffe's first and only one-woman show, which took place at Stieglitz's Gallery 291. That's a very long absence from the public eye. And remember, it's only exhibits and press notices that O'Keeffe has at her disposal in the early 1920s. No social media to post studio shots or works in progress. The only significant appearance she'd made had been as Stieglitz's nude model in his own photography show at the Anderson Galleries 2 years earlier. As critic Henry McBride would recall, and initiated a lot of whispering. O'Keeffe was in serious need of a major rebranding, and this was her hard launch. Though Stieglitz may have been part of the problem, he was also part of the solution. He was still the modern art influencer in New York, and his imprimatur did matter, especially in the press, whose favor he had been cultivating for 15 years. Now, before we look at the rest of the exhibit brochure, let's look at the exhibit itself. We're lucky to have a number of photographs that were taken by Stieglitz. By the way, you can see these exhibit photographs at any time, as well as the paintings in the exhibition, on the O'Keeffe Museum online collections website under Historic Exhibitions heading. This is the top of that page. You see the first show in 1915, and if you scroll down, you'll see all her exhibits, including this one. Now, the exhibit space consisted of one larger gallery and 2 smaller ones on the top of 3 floors of the Anderson Galleries in New York City. It was located at 489 Park Avenue at 59th Street. As you can see, the ceilings were high and the floors carpeted. The walls were covered, possibly with black velour, and you can see the chair rail along the walls there. There are also what look like theater seats in the center of the room. This was quite a traditional art environment, and when Stieglitz takes over one of the rooms for his intimate gallery several years later, he will cover the walls of his gallery with a light transparent gauze to make it have a lighter look. The paintings were rather snugly hung in a horizontal line, roughly at eye level, with larger works hung on their own and smaller ones hung in groups. You can see the skylights, as well as the long light fixtures and several lamps hanging from the ceiling. The paintings are framed, and at least of some of them, if not all, are glazed. You can see a reflection there. The watercolors are on mats and appear to be behind large pieces of transparent protection. It doesn't look like there are any wall labels, as we have come to expect of an exhibit these days, with full details of a work's title, medium, date, and dimensions. Maybe it's because the paintings had no titles. O'Keeffe didn't name her paintings, and she didn't want to put titles on them. When Stieglitz was preparing to submit her work to a group show in 1917, she implored him, quote, "I just want to say one little word. Please don't name anything." But when I began to zoom on these old photos as well as I could barely make out something small like a tag, not quite as big as a label, by the lower left of at least some of the paintings. And I'm wondering that they might have been used to indicate the number and maybe the year of each picture. According to the back page of the brochure, you can see here, the paintings were indeed numbered and dated, if not titled. If there were numbered tags by the paintings, they may have corresponded to the number on the price sheet, or alternatively, they might have been tags indicating a sold item. Now, if you went to the show, you'd likely encounter Stieglitz himself holding forth. It was another way that he framed the discourse about O'Keeffe's art, by literally talking to people about it. For many, including the press, the talk was revelatory, or at least quotable. One of the show's reviews consisted primarily of quotes from Stieglitz, but there was at least one unenthralled visitor we know about who described the experience of Stieglitz expatiating as, quote, stale air. By the way, as you can see here, somewhere along the line, these replicas were written on with the titles of some of the pictures and the names of people, presumably buyers. Some of the paintings are covered over. These are presumably for record purposes. The art was a wide assortment. There were at least 10 of the charcoals and watercolors done before her 1917 solo show, including the nude series and masterworks such as Evening Star 6, and one of my personal favorites shown here, Starlight Night. At least 90 of the paintings were done since her last show. Quote, never before been publicly shown, the brochure assures us. There were abstractions and flowers and still life series of apples and, like here, alligator pears, or what we'd call avocados. There were Lake George scenes and there were Maine coast scenes. 500 people were said to pack the galleries each day. Now, I find that a little hard to believe, but the question remains, how did the visitors, whatever the number, find out about the show? Well, there were the true believers that Stieglitz had accumulated over the years, and there were the customers of the auction house, which likely would have publicized the event. I didn't find any evidence of invitations, but there was a slow drip of articles, reproductions, and interviews, like the one here on the screen, that were released in the months running up to the opening. Now, I was very curious to learn about the venue, the Anderson Galleries, because today we primarily associate Stieglitz with 291. That was the gallery that made him famous as America's chief proselytizer for modern art, after having established himself as a pioneering photographer. Opened in 1908, it was the first to showcase European modern art by the likes of Rodin, Picasso, and Matisse. But by April 1917, when the US entered World War I, Stieglitz's family, he said, was badly hit. Money and the future of the building were uncertain. The old 291 Circle had largely disbanded, and his monopoly on modern art had been eclipsed by its increasing prominence with other New York City galleries, museums, and the press. So this is a picture of the Anderson Galleries here. So, for example, here is the New York World's gallery listings during the second week of O'Keeffe's show. There are 30 listings, at least 7 of them featuring obviously modern art, about 13 of them featuring explicitly American art, and also, interestingly, 10 of them featuring women artists. So this is the context into which O'Keeffe is showing her work. Stieglitz closed down 291 and gave up publishing Camera Work magazine in the summer of 1917 after closing O'Keeffe's first one-woman show. Cast adrift from the battle he had long fought for modern art, he felt, he said, like, quote, Napoleon on his retreat from Moscow. Enter Mitchell Kennerly, who we know from the exhibit brochure was president of the Anderson Galleries. The Anderson Galleries was a venerable Park Avenue auction house, considered the city's foremost auction house for rare books and its second largest auction house for art. British-born, Kennerly had been called the first modern publisher, including among his authors D.H. Lawrence, Oscar Wilde, and Edna St. Vincent Millay. Kennerly went on to become publisher of the Forum magazine, which would sponsor the Forum exhibition of modern art in 1916. That's where O'Keeffe first saw live the work of Arthur Dove, who became a formative influence. That same year, Kennerly joined the Anderson Galleries. And in our next slide, in 1921, Kennerly invited Stieglitz to mount an exhibit of his photography. And here's the front of the brochure for that. Thus began a run of Stieglitz-produced exhibits, including O'Keeffe's, that concluded in 1925 when Stieglitz opened his own dedicated space, the Intimate Gallery, in room 303 of the same building. Alongside Stieglitz's shows, Kennerly was also hosting one-person art shows, as well as group exhibits by the like of the Whitney Studio Club, which was the forerunner of the Whitney Museum of Art, and the National Association of Women Painters and Sculptors. The Anderson Galleries also hosted Stieglitz's auction of Marston Hartley paintings and a group auction of living artists. Kennerly was excited about the prospects for 1923, when both Stieglitz and O'Keeffe would have one-person shows. He wrote to Stieglitz in August 1922 as renovation was being completed on what he described as the newly splendid exhibition rooms, quote, "Hooray, you shall have your pick of the galleries for the two great exhibitions." On an interesting side note, Kennerly was the anonymous buyer who famously purchased 6 of O'Keeffe's calla lilies in 1928 for a then princely sum of $25,000. Here you can see a copy of the sales agreement. Kennerly agreed to pay in quarterly installments, and O'Keeffe agreed not to reveal the name of the buyer. Stieglitz made sure that this remarkable sale made the headlines, as you can see here, giving a good boost to O'Keeffe's public profile. By the way, the first quote in this article comes from Stieglitz, who exclaims, quote, "She is the Lindbergh of art." Like Lindbergh, Miss O'Keeffe typifies the alert American spirit of going after what you want and getting it. But after Anderson was bought out by its biggest competitor and the stock market crashed, Kennerly went broke. In 1931, he had to renege on his agreement because he could no longer continue to meet his quarterly payment obligations. "I think the hardest thing of all," Kennerly wrote to Stieglitz, "has been not meeting George's promissory notes. He had already paid $18,000 to O'Keeffe and returned 3 paintings to settle the account." Now, there's a question I've been asking myself. Why did O'Keeffe wait almost 6 years to have her next show? It's true, after her solo show at 291, she did show sporadically every year or two in group modern shows that Stieglitz helped to organize. For example, there was one at the Young Women's Hebrew Association in New York, and at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, and at the Municipal Building in Freehold, New Jersey. But none of them made her a headliner. From my years of archival research, I understand O'Keeffe, and you may too, as an extraordinarily ambitious artist. So initially, this didn't make sense to me, but that was the mature O'Keeffe that I was thinking about. In the late teens and early 20s, O'Keeffe wasn't quite as ambitious. Quote, "I simply go along," she reported to an old friend. The idea of publicly exhibiting her work was debilitating. She hadn't yet found a way to hand over what she felt as deeply personal work for a public reckoning. 8 months before the big show, she wrote to Stieglitz that, quote, "The idea seems to give me a queer feeling in my stomach, a dizzy feeling in my head, and a perfectly blank state of mind." There was so much work involved. There was all the framing and the hanging, not to mention all the publicity. So O'Keeffe was ambivalent. She described this feeling as far back as 1916 when she wrote to Stieglitz about one of her works. She wrote, "It's like everything else. I want to show it to you, but at the same time, hate to show it to anyone." And this is exactly what she tells us in the brochure. Quote, "I say that I do not want to have this exhibition, but I guess I'm lying. I probably do want to see my things hang on a wall." Given her deep unease about exhibiting, it's not a big surprise that O'Keeffe waited so long to have another one. It's not like Stieglitz still had 291 and could easily slide her onto the schedule. And it wasn't a matter of money, at least at first. The couple had free lodging provided by Stieglitz's niece and then by one of his brothers. And Stieglitz received additional financial support from his brothers. But when they needed to start supporting his mom a little bit more after healthcare, after a stroke, the subsidy to Stieglitz was cut back. In the face of increasing financial pressure, O'Keeffe's inventory of paintings could have provided steady income or ready income. Painting as a livelihood was not a problem for O'Keeffe. It was to her an honorable form of labor. She saw herself and called herself a worker. And then maybe scale was a part of a conscious strategy. Maybe O'Keeffe was waiting to produce those 101 pictures. In later years, she would criticize artists for rushing to exhibit with too few works. And she explicitly advised a young photographer named John Candelario against agreeing to show several of his pictures in a Penitente theme show at the Museum of Modern Art, as thrilled as he was at the opportunity. She counseled him that, quote, "You should have a show on your own first, all for your own self. This sending 2 or 3 things out at a time dissipates interest. Let it ride. They are interested. But I think it can wait. Either you will work and be better, or you won't. If you get more work done, it's better to come out all alone with a good amount of work than to creep out with 3 or 4 at a time." The exhibit brochure includes 2 texts. Stieglitz referred to the text in his exhibit brochures as forewords. He curated them specifically with journalists in mind because newspapers, he explained, must have something to start them. It was another way of framing the discourse around the art, and the strategy worked. Almost every review quotes O'Keeffe or Hartley and follows their lead. Besides revealing her ambivalence about exhibiting and describing what she wants from her audience to hear what they have to say or not say about the work, she first off tells her origin story. She says "I" about 30 times. It's a rather stream of consciousness style, featuring flat declarative sentences. I'd say that it bears a faint resemblance to Gertrude Stein's incantational style. So here, as you can read, she begins at the beginning. "I grew up pretty much as everybody else grows up, and one day 7 years ago found myself saying to myself, I can't live where I want to. I can't go where I want to. I can't do what I want to. I can't even say what I want to." Her origin story is about freedom of individual expression and self-invention and the sui generis ideal of modern art. It's about establishing O'Keeffe as an original. The pictures, she says, have no precedent. They just happened because, quote, I found that I could say things with color and shapes that I couldn't say in any other way. Now that's the sentence that launched 1,000 quotes. Secondarily, O'Keeffe gave credence to the Stieglitz origin story too, concluding that, quote, he is responsible for the present exhibition. In his review, Henry McBride went even further, suggesting that in addition, quote, it is reasonably sure that he is responsible for Miss O'Keeffe, the artist. To this day, that's largely the accepted thinking. But eventually, O'Keeffe tired of the Svengali narrative. After his death, she lamented the misconception and the price she paid for it. Quote, it often sounds as if I was born and taught to walk by him and never thought of paint until he worked on me. I don't really care, but I know I've had to be strong and tough to survive. Alongside O'Keeffe's statement, Stieglitz chose to reprint part of an essay by painter Marston Hartley, which was originally included in Adventures in the Arts, a book published in 1921. Now, of all the texts that Stieglitz might have chosen to feature, this was the most extreme. It was fulsome, bordering on the hysterical. At times, it was nearly incomprehensible. Like, what does this mean? With Georgia O'Keeffe, one takes a far jump into volcanic crateral ethers and sees the world of a woman turned inside out and gaping with deep open eyes and fixed mouth. But wait, it gets even better. Georgia O'Keeffe has had her feet scorched in the laval effusiveness of terrible experience. She has walked on fire and listened to the hissing of vapors round her person. Well, Stieglitz knew that this was the kind of stuff that journalists would eat up. It sounds very lofty, even if it had very little to do with reality or art. But he knew they would eat it up because he was a master of publicity. Some called it propaganda. I like how he was described by Marius Desaius, a friend and fellow modern art champion. Stieglitz, he wrote, had the gift to attract attention and the ability to get hold of that attention and develop it into genuine interest. He had the gift to promote publicity, to raise controversies, and attract art critics of all creeds. As for O'Keeffe, she felt invaded when reading about herself. Quote, the things they write sound so strange and far removed from what I feel of myself. They make me seem like some strange, unearthly sort of creature floating in the air, breathing in clouds for nourishment, when the truth is, I like beefsteak, and I like it rare at that. But the publicity proved inescapable. I don't like publicity, she wrote. It embarrasses me. But as most people buy pictures more through their ears than their eyes, one must be written about and talked about, or the people who buy through their ears think your work is no good and won't buy, and one must sell to live. So one must be written about and talked about whether one likes it or not. It always seems they just say such stupid things. Now, O'Keeffe was hardly being overly sensitive. They did say stupid things, lots of stupid things, like the roundup of women artists here in Vanity Fair. O'Keeffe is featured top center amidst 5 others. The blurb concludes that, quote, her more recent paintings seem to be a revelation of the very essence of woman as life giver. Every time she wrote, I think of that page in Vanity Fair, I just want to snort. Its only redeeming feature is the line at the bottom of the page. So the line at the bottom of the page reads, women painters of America whose work exhibits distinctiveness of style and marked individuality. So what about the exhibit's reviews? Oftentimes reviews are used to measure the success of an exhibit, and in terms of sheer numbers, this one counts as a grand success. There were more than a dozen of them concurrent with the shows, and several more magazine and journal essays that came in the months afterwards. Most of them even managed to spell her name correctly, unlike the one here from the New York Herald. There has been a lot written about O'Keeffe's early reviews, including a splendid scholarly volume by Barbara Buehler-Lines, founding curator of the Keefe Museum. We know that the reviews extended the gendered language and ideas that Stieglitz used to frame O'Keeffe's art. The forewords in the brochure, in addition to Stieglitz's in-gallery commentary, did indeed give the journalist a starting point for their write-ups. Most of them directly, even extensively, quoted O'Keeffe or Hartley. All of them insisted on personalizing or psychoanalyzing the art as if they could divine some intimate knowledge of her inner person. For O'Keeffe, I can only imagine how exhausting and infuriating that must have been. And in fact, O'Keeffe was exhausted by the exhibit. Excitement always made her sick, and a week after the opening, she took to bed with the flu. Over the years, she would continue to meet the pressure of annual exhibits, but they took their physical toll. It became a common pattern, hanging the show, maybe doing an interview or two, then taking to bed to recover. Unsurprisingly, O'Keeffe was not satisfied by her reviews. The work for her next year's show, she wrote to a friend, would be objective as I can make it, because she didn't like the interpretation of my other things. After deciding the critics talked more about themselves than her art, O'Keeffe paid them little heed for the rest of her life. Not that many of the reviewers actually wrote about the art, but I gotta say, as a critic myself, I do have sympathy for their plight. Faced with paintings unlike anything they'd seen before, how would these writers know how to look at them, let alone comment on them? So I can understand their struggle and their temptation to fall back on the press release, so to speak. There is one among the reviewers who dares to deal with any substance about the actual paintings. Georgia O'Keeffe, American, was written by Herbert Seligman, a journalist friend of Stieglitz, published in Manuscripts, a short-lived magazine edited by Seligman, Stieglitz, and fellow critic Paul Rosenfeld. He wrote, "What is an ocean wave of the Maine coast? How represent the space of Texas plains and the skies over them? How translate the spirit of one living here and now, man or woman? Color is her language. A few bold, delicate strokes lay upon paper a woman's figure in vibrant red, or green and slate shot with rose. Families of apples laugh radiantly. White zinnias stare quaintly. Winds blow among dark trees. Solid-seeming forms clash upon her design, seem to thrust out from her canvas, relieve themselves from surface." So what about sales? Another important element of any art exhibit. At the bottom of the final page shown here, we see the only reference to sales. It reads, "Anyone interested in purchasing a picture may obtain the prices from Mr. W. M. Grant or Mrs. W. M. H. Smith." Mr. Grant was Walter Grant, who was the art director of the Anderson Galleries, but I haven't found a trace of Mrs. Smith. At this point, Stieglitz's primary goal with his small stable of artists was to assure them a living wage so they could keep on working. He and O'Keeffe recognized the need for an income, but they still felt some reluctance to release her works out into the world. O'Keeffe wrote to a buyer, quote, He is sad if they go and sad if they don't go, like his mother was with her children, not wanting them out of her sight and wanting them to be a success. Stieglitz set the prices. The more personal the work was for him, it appears, the higher he priced it, and continued to raise the price over the course of the show. O'Keeffe had already been doing well with her sales. The year before, she participated in an auction of modern art concocted by Stieglitz and Kennerly as a sporting event. O'Keeffe sold all of her entries, 3 oil paintings and a pastel, for a total of $850. That's about $15,000 in today's dollars. Here we see Red Barn Lake George, which was sold to publisher Herschel V. Jones for $350, the 3rd highest price for the evening. This one, Cedar and Red Maple Lake George, sold for $270 to Alma Wertheim, wife of investment banker Morris Wertheim. And Apples and Scallops went to investment banker Alfred J. Seligman for $150. From the 1923 exhibit, about 20 works were sold, mainly to Stieglitz insiders or their friends and family. O'Keeffe cleared $3,500 from the show, according to her friend, Anita Politzer, who observed that the sum represented nearly twice as much as her annual teacher's salary had been in Texas. In today's dollars, that's about $62,000. Stieglitz's goal had been to sell enough to generate $1,000 in commissions to the Anderson galleries. And if we assume that O'Keeffe had the same agreement as Stieglitz had for his photo exhibit in 1921, that is a 25% commission to split between Mr. Grant and the Anderson galleries after cost deducted, then he met his goal. I have never failed to make my living selling pictures since my first big show at the Anderson galleries, O'Keeffe reminded Edith Halpert, her gallerist, decades later. To make my living every year is my idea of the only way to have any feeling of stability in my life. I've been able to find one sales receipt from the show. Here it is. Arthur Dove, another of Stieglitz's longtime artists from 291, and a formative influence on O'Keeffe's abstractions. As we can see here, paid $150 for one painting in $50 installments. The painting he bought was Abstraction. Here it is, an oil painting from 1919. At 9 by 10.5 inches, it was small enough to be hung in his houseboat on the Long Island Sound. And in October, he wrote to Stieglitz, "The O'Keeffe painting looks better than ever, especially in the boat, here by the light of our lantern." O'Keeffe identified so deeply with her paintings that she recalled years later, the early exhibits were embarrassingly painful. But as time went on, the annual exhibit was part of her work rhythm. Leaving the city for the summer and fall to paint in the country, whether at Lake George or later New Mexico, then back to the city to finish the paintings and mount the show in the winter. She cleaned up her obligations of New York City in the spring, and then she eagerly head back to the country to begin the cycle all over again. For O'Keeffe, exhibits became a necessary evil. "I had a show every year," she told filmmaker Perry Miller with a mixture of pride and amazement. Every year for 24 years. Yes, O'Keeffe complained about exhibits. They required too much time and energy, which she'd rather expend on the making of art. Quote, "For most people, a show is a joy. For me, it's a bore, a headache." She insisted, still 40 years later, and they literally made her sick. But the exhibits served her purpose. For better or worse, exhibits were the way to make her living. And later, after Stieglitz died and her livelihood and reputation were secure, retrospectives became the way to maintain her market and to secure a lasting legacy. But more importantly, O'Keeffe made her annual exhibits into a creative planning tool. For her, seeing her year's output arranged all together on the walls of a gallery was an essential step in her work process. It was a form of feedback and an assessment. I have to see where I have been, she explained, and where I am going. When she got the paintings up on the wall, she, quote, shed it all like a snake sheds its skin. Then she had to arrange for her next steps. Seeing as myself as I do, she wrote, when I see my year on the wall, makes starting at it all again rather difficult. I try to make out a direction for myself for at least a year, and that involves my personal living as well as my working. Which makes me think back by way of conclusion to O'Keeffe's origin story. The irony is that despite all her fuss about exhibits, her own true art began with an exhibit. It was a private showing just for herself when she was a young art student in Columbia, South Carolina. All around her, she hung her student works and took a long, hard look. And based upon what she saw, she made her decision. She made the break from academic training and launched herself as O'Keeffe, the artist. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. And if you have any questions besides what we answer here, you can always go to anndaly.com. There's a contact form, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you so much. That was great. I learned a lot. We do have one question so far. We have about 10 minutes to answer.
Great.
And the question comes from Anne, who actually know. Hi, Anne, shout out. Do you feel O'Keeffe would have been so infamous at such an early age if it weren't for Stieglitz?
Well, as a historian, it's kind of out of my remit, because as a historian, I'm trying to look at the evidence of what happened and base my response upon that. And it's really not something I do to speculate what might have happened or would have happened. Who knows? Who knows what might have happened? Maybe she would have been famous from another gallerist at another place. So hard to answer.
Understandable. Thank you so much. A question from Kathy. What is the direction of your new book on O'Keeffe?
Thank you for asking. I'm really interested in the actual artwork and her process of making art. There have been wonderful biographies, many of them talk about her as a person, but I was really fell dumbstruck in front of one of her paintings, Mount Fuji, from much later. And I started to read books, and I wanted to know about how she did what she did and made me react the way I did. And I just got so interested and had more questions and more questions. And I'm, an academic and writer from too many years. And I just thought, I need to find out. I'm curious. And I just kept going on. And so each chapter is, it's in chronological order, and each of about 20 chapters is one of her paintings, and I really build a story around each of her paintings to understand more about how they were made, what they meant at the time, and what her process was. So hopefully we'll learn a lot from a deep dive going in time over what changed and what stayed the same, and what her work, still means to us today.
Thank you, Anne. For those of us in New Mexico, Mount Fuji is up in our very last gallery in the
now. That was the one. That was the one. That was the one. And it has been conserved and cleaned recently. So now we can all go see it and stand there and just, have the floor just dropped out from under me. And I went to that place where I go when I see any kind of great art. So do go. do go see that one. There's also a smaller one that I fell in love with afterwards because that used to be on the walls.
A question from Tracy. If O'Keeffe didn't want to name her paintings, do you know how they ended up with names?
Oh my gosh, that is one of my questions, Tracy. Well, I think in the early years, I suspect, and others may be better able to answer this, that Stieglitz just puts names on them. And then after he died, someone else had to put name on them. And I think she became pragmatic, if nothing else. I mean, on some things she would not budge, and on some things she was pragmatic. And I think that she knew they had to have something. So in the early, it's interesting, in the earliest brochures for exhibits, there wouldn't be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There would be 1 to 7 apples, 8 to 10 alligator pears. So at that, she got around it then by identifying it by what it was, or abstraction, or color painting, or something like that. So, but later on, and this is something I as I make my way through the book and go through different, a deep dive in different time periods, later she does put a bit more titles that are a little bit more evocative. So, you know, we all evolve. The thing about O'Keeffe we have to remember is she was painting for 60 years, and you're not the same as you were, you know, a year, 10, 60 years ago. So maybe she then later in years changed her mind a bit, or understood that the market needed something more than the first pair, and also became a problem with keeping records. You know, which black paste are we talking about, when she had all of these series? So it was that matter of that as well. Thanks for a great question.
Thank you. Beverly asks, from the image of the advertisement of O'Keeffe among the other female artists, do you know if there are any other artists who went on to be successful?
Oh, I'm trying to remember. I remember I don't think there are any, no, that were the same magnitude of reputation as O'Keeffe. I think Whitney, what was her first name? Began with a G. I think, who was involved in the Whitney Studio Club. She was a sculptor, and I think she had sculptors, if I remember correctly, on view that week. And her works are still on view as well, but she's probably better known as one of the founders of the Whitney Museum of American Art. But no, Georgia's the only one that I can remember. And the men, no. Oh, there was one show from a museum that had the likes of Matisse and Picasso, so they were already recognized.
Thank you. Lots of questions about when can we read your book?
Thank you for the enthusiasm. You know, it's gotten to be an embarrassing question, because the first year I went to the O'Keeffe Research Center, I had to look this up, was 2015. She wrote a lot of letters. There's my office, if you can see it, I've just been cleaning it up after finishing this talk, is just filled with primary resources. You know, the letters she wrote, the archives all across the country. I'm a bit OCD about primary research, but I'm happy to report that I'm pretty much near the end. I have started writing 4 chapters. They do take time. This is all a long way of saying maybe a couple of years, but I do write as I go along. So if you want to go to anndaly.com or mygeorgiaokeeffe.com and sign up for the newsletter. Also, I have things that I've written there that you can get a sneak preview. Thanks for asking.
Thank you, Anne. We got a question about O'Keeffe and if she hung most of her exhibits herself.
Oh, excellent question. She loved hanging. She was great at hanging, and she was very picky about hanging. She was a beautiful hanging. I have a whole set of research labeled hanging. She was very good at it. She probably learned from Stieglitz. Interesting tidbit, when she was teaching in Texas, she taught interior decoration, and the book was by Parsons, the same Parsons as in the Parsons School of Design in New York. And there was a section on hanging paintings in a modern way. So maybe she started to think about it there. And so she insisted on hanging her shows. Of course, she did it at the Stieglitz galleries for 24 years. But when she started having the big retrospectives, she made a lot of curators' life a little bit difficult and stressful. At least once off the top of my head, I can remember her going in and just rehanging the whole thing. So she wanted to frame her work literally just as Stieglitz had framed it for the 1923 show. She knew that all of that mattered. She learned it from him, and she was just as masterful at literally and metaphorically framing her art. Even though I must say she refused to talk about it much because her strategy, and I think sort of rightly so, she just let people say what they wanted to say. She thought people have their right to their opinion and interpretation of the paintings, up to them, not my problem, I make art. She would sometimes change errors in facts, but even then she began to, they're going to write what they write. You know, if I took all my time to make corrections, I'd never make art. She did give some interviews, not a lot of them. I use them a lot as basis, but she wanted the works really to speak for themselves. And when people ask her what they meant, she goes, well, if you don't know, I'm not going to be able to explain it to you.
That's funny. Very O'Keeffe. I think that question came from Connie. So thank you, Connie.
Thank you, Connie.
A question from Joan. Do you know if the Anderson Gallery building still exists? And if so, what is in the gallery space?
You have stumped me, Joan. You get a chocolate. I don't. And if anyone lives in New York City, what was it, 489 Park Avenue at 59th Street? I can't imagine it's still there. It was only 3 stories, so I imagine it's been redeveloped. But sorry, you stumped me. You win.
Hopefully it's not a Starbucks or anything.
Don't.
Apollo asks, were there any women critics of her work in her career?
Yes, there were. Of the critics that I read for 23, and I may not have it correctly totally, there was at least Helen Appleton Reed. There was another one that doesn't come immediately to mind. So there were several during this period. There was a woman that she befriended. She wasn't a critic. She was a New York Times journalist. Asbury, she has 3 names. But the best critics I think she had came at the end of her life, when after abstract expressionism, when O'Keeffe positioned herself very keenly to be connected with the abstract artists of the 60s and 70s. People began to understand what she had done at this time in the 20s, so much earlier than the 60s and the 70s. And for my money, of course, that's just me, Barbara Haskell was one of the critics, and Barbara Rose, both came along and really deeply looked at her work. And I think were the critics that she really deserved. And for coincidence or not, they were both women. Oh, and there's Blanche Matthias was one from the early years as well.
Thank you. We got the Q&A box is going really crazy. Just, lots of questions. But an anonymous attendee said that they know the Anderson Gallery no longer exists.
Okay, thank you so much, Anonymous. That it takes a village, really. I mean,
Right.
there are so many O'Keeffe scholars on whose, shoulders I try to stand. It takes all of us to it's an amazing amount of information. It's really, I can't keep it in my head. I have to keep just really good indexes for my research. So thank you, Anonymous. Does Anonymous know what's there by any chance? Is it a faceless apartment building?
I don't think so. Susan, another attendee, added that looking through the Google Street View, there's no longer right. There's no longer 489 Park Avenue, only 499 and 485. So maybe it was erased and consolidated into another building.
Yeah, but I would suspect so. I know 291 is gone as well. So yeah.
Such is time. I think we have time for just one more question.
Okay.
Apologies to everyone who, we didn't get to your questions. There was a big number of questions coming through. If they're pressing, you can always reach out to Anne through her website yourself, or reach out to us at learning@o'keeffemuseum.org. But our final one is one I'm curious about too. Have you ever run into any of Ida O'Keeffe's history or her artwork or letters in your research about Georgia?
I do. I have my file on Ida. She pops up. So for instance, she wrote a couple of letters to Sherwood Anderson, which were kind of odd, I must say. Just recently I was rereading O'Keeffe's letters to her sister Claudia, and they were consolidating money to either buy a house or rent a house for Ida. At that point, it would have been later on. Yes, and in the early years, her visit in the 20s, everyone's in love with Ida. She's very very lively. Yeah. And it seems from a letter to Sherwood Anderson, we usually think that I think Paul Rosenfeld that she had some interest in, and Stieglitz may have put the kibosh on that, but it seems that she was interested in Arnold Ronenbach, the German photographer or sculptor. So lots of little things, but not big chunks, stuff that, one would have to connect the dots. And again, any other questions, annedaly.com, there's a contact form there. I'm happy to answer questions. Anybody knows anything to offer and add, like whether the building's still up, I'm happy to hear too and add that to the mix. And thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. Grace, thanks. You've been great.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anne. That was a really wonderful presentation. To everyone else, this recording is available on our website and on our Georgia O'Keeffe Museum YouTube in about a week's time. And have a great rest of your day wherever you are in the US or internationally. And thank you, Anne, once again. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.